Hello and welcome to our coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. At least 50 people dead and dozens wounded after rockets hit a train station in the city of Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says the war in Ukraine has exposed the inability of the United Nations Security Council to fulfill its mandate of international peace and security. Plus, Slovakia sends its air defense system to Ukraine. Welcome once again. Ukraine says at least 50 people are dead, dozens wounded after rockets hit a train station in the city of Kramatorsk, east of Ukraine. Thousands of people were at the station at the time as they fled Russian attacks. Russia denies involvement in the strike, with the Kremlin spokesman saying it had no scheduled missions in the area. Meanwhile, Russia is stepping up its offensive in the Donbas region, east of Ukraine, as it withdraws from the north cities. They have come under Russian attack overnight, with residents sheltering in basements and Sverondesk hit by rocket fire. We'll hear more on the situation on ground.
The governor of the Donetsk region, Pavlo Krylenko, says the railway station in the eastern city of Kramatorsk was hit by cluster munitions. Thousands of people have used the station in recent days to escape the east as Russia refocuses its military campaign on that part of the country. Russia denies involvement in the strike, with a Kremlin spokesman saying it had no scheduled missions in the area. Ukraine's President Zelensky has dismissed Russian denials, saying this is an evil that has no limits. Zelensky warns atrocities in Borodyanka are much worse than what the world saw in Bucha. Russia is stepping up its offensive in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine as it withdraws from the north. Cities there have come under heavy Russian attack overnight, with residents sheltering in basements and several in Donetsk hit by rocket fire. Meanwhile, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, is in Ukraine and has visited the town of Bucha, the site where Ukrainian officials have said hundreds of civilians have been found dead since Russian troops pulled back from last week. The European Commission chief and Joseph Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat, traveled to Kiev to offer Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky support and reassurance over his bid for EU membership in a capital gradually reviving after Russia pulled back forces.
The unthinkable has happened here. We have seen the cruel face of Putin's army. We have seen the recklessness and the cold-heartedness with which they have been occupying the city. Here in Bucha we saw our humanity being shattered, and the whole world is mourning with the people of Bucha. And they are the ones who are, as you said, defending the border of Europe, defending humanity, defending democracy, and therefore we stand with them in this important fight.
Nice to see you all here. Please place your voting cards in the machines.
The European Union has agreed further sanctions targeting Russia. The EU says this fifth package of restrictive measures is aimed at ramping up economic pressure on the Kremlin and aims to cripple its ability to finance its invasion of Ukraine. And more on international diplomacy. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is meeting German Chancellor Olaf Scholz for talks and will give a joint news conference shortly.
And VOA's correspondent Anna Chernikova joins us now for more on the situation in Ukraine. Hello, Anna. We're hearing at least 50 people dead, dozens wounded after rockets hit a train station in Kramatorsk. Tell us more about that.
Hello. Yes, unfortunately, today in the morning, when more than a couple of thousand of people were waiting for the train for evacuation, from the east in the city of Kramatorsk, which is now a center city for evacuation. 2 Russian rockets reached the square at the entrance of the train station and the waiting hall of the train station, where a couple of thousand of people were waiting for the train. According to the information that we have so far, at least 50 people are dead, 5 of them children, and over 100 people have been hurt and hurt very badly. It was a very expansive rocket that reached that area, so there is no doubt it was a very concrete target, a very exact target, this train station. This is, for the moment, this is the only way for people from east part of Ukraine, from Donetsk and Luhansk region, and partly from Kharkiv region to escape and to evacuate for more safe place.
And this is really worrying, what we're hearing from there, because we understand thousands of people were at this station when it occurred. But then we're also hearing that Russia is denying involvement, in the strike. Kremlin spokesperson saying that it actually had no scheduled missions, in that area. So tell us a bit about Kramatorsk and its proximity to the Donbass region, Donetsk, Luhansk.
Russian side, they are actually denying the war. They are actually denying the casualties and all those people dead in Kiev region, in the city of Bucha, Irpin, and so on and so forth. So, of course, Ukraine is not really listening to their, comments on that. In general, now the main war ground and the main fightings are happening in the east. So the city of Kramatorsk is currently under Ukrainian control, and it's a center for evacuation. If we talk about Donetsk and Luhansk region and Kharkiv region in general, there are severe fightings happening right now and severe strikes happening right now from the Russian side. So this is, for the moment, this is the main scene for fighting and the main battlefield in Ukraine. In a couple of days, there are expectations of quite bad escalation. So we are seeing Russian forces getting ready for another huge attack. So next couple of days will be very, very difficult for the region.
And the President of the European Commission is in Kyiv at the moment. Are there any expectations from Ukrainian people about that visit?
Well, the most important is that our European partners, European colleagues, are seeing all the crimes which have happened already in the Kyiv region that we'll know so far by themselves. So, there are a lot of footages, a lot of photos and videos from this region. But when you come there personally and see all that on your own, it creates a completely different perception on how bad it is. You just realize, the whole picture. You just realize how terrific it is. So, of course, the expectation is that this would help for further investigations, for further for our European colleagues to proceed with investigations and further judgment of all that crimes, and of course financial and military support, which is extremely needed right now.
Talk to us, those atrocities. Some experts are saying that perhaps what happened in Bucha is nothing compared to what happened in Mariupol, and there's also that in Bordianka. Can you explain to us?
Unfortunately, what you've seen in Bucha, and when you come there, it's just. I was yesterday. I was in that region, and when you see all that, you cannot imagine anything worse. But according to what we hear from the military forces and from from the governmental officials who have been already in Borodyanka, which is now closed for any entrance because of the demining and all the works which are happening to clean up, to get bodies and so on and so forth. We are expecting that situation would be much worse than in Bucha. Unfortunately, I think that there will be much more casualties, and this is really very, very sad because both Bucha and Borodyanka, they are almost completely destroyed. If we talk about Mariupol, this is, again, it remains the worst case in this war because we don't know exactly what's happening in the city. We just know that Russian forces have started to use crematoriums to destroy bodies of the civilians already. So it would be really much more difficult to find out the real number of casualties. But what we know so far that there definitely going to be thousands of dead civilians in Mariupol, and it's really, really scary to think of what we're going to find out. And hopefully we will find out what's really happening in Mariupol.
Indeed, and it's on that basis that, the investigation is ongoing with war crime allegations to Russia. But we'd like to appreciate your time, Anna, and do stay safe. Anna, VOA's correspondent, Anna Chernikova, joining us from Ukraine. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Russia must not win the war in Ukraine, and Ukraine must not lose it. German Vice Chancellor and Economy Minister Robert Habeck said this today. He told reporters the government was planning to set up an economic shock absorber to help German businesses cope with the fallout from the war in Ukraine. He said the economic package is pinpointed, it avoids disincentives, it's comprehensive. Under the plan, the government will offer loans worth an estimated €7 billion to companies hit by the effects of the war via State Development Bank, KfW. And staying with Germany, German authorities have banned a Russian-owned Boeing 747 from taking off after the cargo plane underwent maintenance at Frankfurt-Hahn Airport, which now falls under EU sanctions due to the war in Ukraine. Sanctions imposed by the Western powers prevent Russian airlines buying aircraft parts or maintenance services from Europe or the United States, adding to the pressure on the world's 11th largest aviation market from a ban on using North American and European airspace. According to a written statement by the spokesman of the insolvency administrator for the small airports, which filed for bankruptcy last October, the owners at the Frankfurt-Hahn are being charged a daily parking fee of €3 per ton of the maximum permissible takeoff weight. This is Cargo Logic Air UK. They say the German broadcaster is quoting the German Transport Ministry, saying that it owned by Cargo Logic Holding Limited, which in turn is owned by Alexei Izyankin and Sergei Shilyanik, both of whom are Russian citizens. Izyakin appears as president on the internet site of Moscow-based Vlogger Managing Company and also as senior vice president. And Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, indeed has been visiting the town of Bucha near the Kyiv, northern Ukraine. Bucha was the town where bodies of civilians were found lying in the street after Russia's withdrawal. Of course, Russia denies killing civilians and has accused Ukraine of staging the deaths to discredit its troops. Well, joining us from on that, Deutsche Welle correspondent Chelsea Dulani. She joins us from Berlin. Hi, Chelsea. The Commission President is in Kyiv today to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. I mean, that comes amid the increasing evidence that Russian troops have committed atrocities against civilians in Ukraine. Chelsea?
Well, Ursula von der Leyen has said that the purpose of this visit is to show the EU's, quote, unwavering support for Ukraine. And she says that solidarity is more important now than ever because of what you mentioned before, the increasing evidence of war crimes, of atrocities committed by Russian troops in Ukraine. So this has really galvanized Europe's leaders as well as politicians all around the world to really increase penalties and sanctions and on Russia. So yesterday the EU passed a 5th round of sanctions on Russia, but today there's also likely to be a lot of discussion about how the EU can offer more humanitarian, more military aid to Ukraine. The EU Commission has a proposal floating around right now for about 500 million euros worth of arms support to Ukraine as well. They're likely to discuss today other humanitarian aid and trade proposals. One of the big issues for the global economy right now is that Ukraine is a major supplier of wheat, and a lot of that wheat is not able to get out of Ukraine. So that's another thing that they've said they will talk about. I'd say that really, though this is sort of being painted as a symbolic effort to show support for Ukraine, there also likely will be some concrete outcomes.
Still more of that support is, EU approving a ban on Russian coal imports in response to the atrocities committed by Russian troops in the town of Bucha. How significant is this?
Well, it's significant in the sense that the EU so far until now hasn't targeted Russian energy in its sanctions. And the reason is because Russia is a huge supplier of energy, whether that be coal, oil, natural gas to the EU. So they've been really hesitant to touch that because of the economic consequences, how that is already raising prices here for energy in the European Union. But now they are targeting coal. People have described this as the low-hanging fruit for the EU. The EU pays Russia about 85 million euros every day to buy coal, but to buy natural gas and oil, it's paying over 800 million euros every day. So this is really a drop in the bucket in terms of Russian energy supply, but it does signal that the EU is becoming more willing to target that Russian energy. So on Monday, they're likely to discuss banning Russian oil imports. That's sort of the second most important fuel source for the EU from Russia. They still are quite hesitant to discuss banning natural gas imports, which that's a huge source for Europe. It accounts for about 40% of the EU's natural gas sources. So that's something they haven't really come around on yet, but they certainly are becoming more willing to target Russian energy.
And Chelsea, speaking of sanctions, Finland has seized almost $50 million worth of art suspected of violating EU sanctions in Russia. What more can you tell us about this case?
Well, the Finnish customs authorities have seized these 3 shipments. They were seized on the Russian border with Finland, and these were artworks, paintings, sculptures that had been on exhibition in Japan and Italy and were on their way back to Russia. The problem with this is that the EU sanctions prevent transporting of luxury goods, including artwork, to Russia. So the Finnish customs authorities say they've opened investigations into 10 people who have helped transport this art that is against the law. But I think this is an interesting story because it shows a lot of our focus right now is on how sanctions are impacting the energy industry or, for example, the financial industry and banking. But the art world also is having a major reckoning right now because Russia has been, for decades, a huge player in the global art world. Oligarchs like Roman Abramovich have been some of the biggest art collectors in the world. And now there certainly is an effort and there's a lot of disruptions in the global art world because they're having to look more and more at where that money came from. And so I think this shows just how widespread the impact of Western sanctions is on really every part of the global economy.
Chelsea Delany, Deutsche Welle correspondent, many thanks. Still to come on the program, the United Nations General Assembly, we have more on that as they send a clear message suspending Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Do join us again. Welcome back. The United Nations General Assembly yesterday suspended Russia from the UN Human Rights Council over reports of gross and systematic violations and abuses of human rights in Ukraine, prompting Moscow to announce it was quitting the body. The US-led push garnered 93 votes in favor, while 24 countries voted no and 58 countries abstained. A two-thirds majority of voting members in the 193-member General Assembly in New York, abstentions do not count, was needed to suspend Russia from the 47-member Geneva-based Human Rights Council. Speaking after the vote, Russia's deputy UN ambassador Gennady Kuzmin announced that Russia had decided to quit the Human Rights Council altogether. Russia was in its second year of a three-year term. Under Thursday's resolution, the General Assembly could have later agreed to end the suspension, but that cannot happen now. Russia has quit the council, just as the United States did in 2018 over what it called chronic bias against Israel and a lack of reform. The United States was last year re-elected to the council. Suspensions are rare. Libya was suspended in 2011 because of violence against protesters by forces loyal to the then leader Muammar Gaddafi. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said the United Nations sent a clear message: the suffering of victims and survivors will not be ignored. Michelle Agatishe is a senior associate in a leading law firm in Africa and fellow of the Program for African Leadership at the LSE. He joins us now on the program. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Millicent. It's always a pleasure to be here.
First, I'd like to get your take on the latest from Ukraine, and that is the number of people dead, dozens wounded after rockets hit a train station east of Ukraine. Now, we understand that thousands of people were there, trying to evacuate, trying to flee Russian attacks. But then you have Russia, on the other hand, denying any involvement in the strike, saying it didn't have any scheduled missions. I mean, what do you think is happening there?
I mean, it's a terrible situation because no matter how we analyze the situation, at the bottom line of it all is the fact that we're dealing with human lives. And it's just so saddening to know that human lives are being used in this grand scheme and games and plans and strategy that we see going on. Just before leaving this subject, it's critical and important to remember that this appears to be a pattern of conduct from the Russian side. So even leading up to the attack on Ukraine, even leading up to the war, we saw that almost every false flag action and otherwise, the Russians always came out to disdain and say that, look, we were not involved in this. So it's almost the situation of the guy who cried wolf, that anything that now comes out of the Russian side, many a times, a lot of people, for right reasons, choose not to believe it. I mean, it's quite far-fetched to believe that the Ukrainians will kill Ukrainian citizens just to be able to score a media point, particularly to the extent that, this is the height of war, right? And these are human lives and, destinies that have been cut short just at that moment.
In the month, I think this was last month, Russia's Ministry of Defense had given a certain figure saying that over 1,351 of its soldiers had been killed. Ukraine, of course, was putting that figure at almost 19,000. So neither Russian or Ukraine's estimates can be independently verified. But then analysts have cautioned that Russia might be downplaying its casualty rate, while Ukraine could be inflating it to boost morale. We don't know. But of course, Western leaders have their own figures with what is really happening. But are there really any winners in this war?
No, there are no winners in this war. No matter how this war comes to an end, it's always going to be a scourge on human history. It's always going to be a scourge on relations between Ukraine and Russia. It is the case that so many people have died, no matter how many numbers, or rather what number we put on that figure. I mean, it's interesting because, the Russians had said it was about 1,000 thereabouts. But just yesterday, a senior public figure in the Russian government came out to admit that they have indeed suffered significant losses. And it's also the case that we have seen that the Russians have, re-strategized and said that, look, we're no longer focusing on Kyiv and the rest of the country. We're now focusing on eastern Ukraine. And that seems to suggest that it's out of a realization that, yes, we have lost people, we have lost men, we have lost significant senior officials. I hear at the last reading that it was about 11 to 12 senior generals in the Russian army that had died. There can be no winners in this war. In fact, if there's going to be any winner, it is, as Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, said, it has to be Ukraine, and Russia cannot be allowed to win. It is the case that even if militarily, right, certain objectives are then said by the Russians to have been won, then what happens about the war of the heart, right? It was the case that Russia going in, they were going in as quote unquote liberators for the Luhansk and the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. But I mean, just yesterday, the eastern Ukraine, which is where the train station that was attacked is located. So even the people therein, would they ever see the Russians as liberators? Would their actions ever be justified? Will history be kind to Putin? And also, we have seen that the economy of Russia has more or less been destroyed. I hear that the ruble, that's the Russian currency, is the worst performing currency at the moment. So when you look at it from that context, you then ask yourself that even if there is any victory, at what cost? Even if there is any victory, would Putin ever be accepted into the Committee of Nations? Even if there is any victory, what remains of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, as well as the former members of the Soviet Union that are around there, such as Lithuania, such as Finland, and the like? Would they ever trust Russia? That is an answer that I'm sure is evident also.
Well, still talking about what Russia has been saying, significant losses of its troops. We heard Dmitry Peskov, as presidential spokesman, say that they hoped Moscow would reach its war goals in the coming days. A lot of people are trying to, decode what he actually means by that in the coming days. Does that mean there'll be more offensive, or, this war will actually come to an end? Because he also claims that Russia is searching for ways to end the war. What do you think?
Well, what I think is that it is the case that if you go into a battle and you see that, the grand designs of what you had expected cannot then be fulfilled, you more or less shift the goalpost such that you can save face to a large extent. I would say that from where I sit, I think that Russia has counted and continues to count their losses, not only in terms of men on the ground, but also in terms of the economy. They have to understand that fighting a war costs money, and to the extent that every day we're seeing new sanctions being placed on Russia and Russian citizens, question then arises as to whether there is even any more money to continue to persecute the war at the extent to which the war has been persecuted. For us as neutral, independent bystanders, what we can hope for is that indeed we see some form of peace, and that the people of Ukraine, particularly of eastern Ukraine, who seem to be bearing the full brunt at the moment, will begin to see some form of reprieve. The people of Mariupol will be able to walk down the streets again. The people of Donetsk will be able to look out the windows. And the people that died in this, Bucha, I believe, where, we now see allegations of war crimes and genocide, at least maybe we can then begin to have the foundations to have some form of healing, which surely would take several decades to be actualized.
Let's go outside for a bit. The series of meetings between NATO, foreign ministers, G7 members, the EU, and even the UN Security Council, how would you say they've really impacted the war, for better or for worse?
Well, it is the case that one could only ever assess something like this with the benefit of hindsight. So the effectiveness of those meetings are things that will be written about in history books in years to come. And that is when we would be able to see if, in fact, they have been useful, right? But to the extent that we see that the war is coming to an end, I mean, there have been wars that have lasted for years, right? And to the extent that at least we haven't seen this degenerate into nuclear warfare, which was a very real risk at some point, particularly at the start of this war, then I believe that indeed maybe something is going right. But that doesn't mean that we should rest on our oars or should celebrate to the extent that people are still dying every single day and that we're seeing allegations of war crimes happening. But if we can have some form of peace, I think I would join the people of Ukraine to say, whichever that peace comes from, whichever strategy is utilized, let there be peace.
But let's go to the most recent from the UNSC. 93 of 193 members voting in favor of diplomatic rebuke following allegations of mass human rights. How significant is this, even though Moscow announced its resignation from the Council in response? Okay, let me take that question again, Michel, and that is with regards to the UN General Assembly voting in favor of the diplomatic rebuke following allegations of mass human rights abuses by Russian troops. How significant is this? And this is also seeing as, Moscow announced its resignation from the Council in response.
Absolutely. How I see it as a public international lawyer is something that I thoroughly enjoy and continue to advise on, is that this is really symbolic rather than significant. The UN Human Rights Council is a very important body of the United Nations, but this is not without precedent. We have seen in the past the United States of America also resigning their seats on the United Nations Human Rights Council. We have also seen in the past where they have criticized the work of the United Nations Human Rights Council in respect of bias in favor of, or rather in terms of investigating what's going on in Palestine. So in terms of the significance, is this something that is going to result in Putin feeling that, oh dear, indeed now I have to come on bended knees to beg? No. In terms of symbolism, it's important because at least you are not projecting a council that is supposed to be, for want of a better phrase, the last resort for the downtrodden person whose human rights are being trampled upon. What image does it conjure when they see Russia sitting on that body? Of course, it doesn't conjure an image that inspires confidence, particularly in light of recent allegations of war crimes that have happened rather. So symbolically, it is very significant. But in terms of what impact it will have, I believe that there's so much more the United Nations can be doing that they have not done. And just to wrap up that point, it's also quite important to also look at the number of countries that abstained and the number of countries that also voted against Russia being kicked off. And when you combine those countries together, you then begin to see that it appears that there is even a sort of fracture in the international community, because then it doesn't actually then equate to 2/3. It's more like 90-something to 70-something. And that raises questions, right? It raises questions as to what level or what importance that many of these countries accord human rights. And I mean, as a Nigerian citizen, seeing Nigeria abstain, right, I feel it's something that raises questions for us to further analyze and see exactly what our own international public policy, particularly as it relates to human rights, is, right? For us not to be confident enough to vote that, yes, indeed, even if symbolically Russia should be kicked off the United Nations Human Rights Council.
You've said the UN should be doing a lot more, but
yes.
So far, von der Leyen's visit to Zelensky is happening right now. He asked for more weapons, but he's getting visits instead. Do you think these visits could boost morale for Ukraine in this war?
Yes, I believe it can. I mean, von der Leyen is the most senior personnel in the European Union, right? And to that extent, it demonstrates clearly, without any equivocation, who the European Union stands with. And we do know that the successes that Ukraine has been able to actualize against Russia thus far, in terms of pinning back what one could consider the only other superpower, has really resulted from the, should I say, aid, particularly military aid that has been countries to Ukraine. So when you look at it from that perspective, I in fact think that it's a very important visit. And to the extent that this visit is combined with what the EU is doing, i.e. Sanctions by EU member countries, i.e. supply of arms, i.e. taking in Ukrainian refugees to countries that are within the EU, then I think it is very important. However, to the extent that this does not result in Ukraine joining the European Union, which indeed is one of Ukraine's major demands and requests, then the question then relates, or rather arises, that is this enough? And will this be enough bandage to the wounds that the Ukrainians have suffered?
Perhaps in a few seconds, do you see any hope with the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, with how things have gone so far this week? Because a lot has indeed happened.
Well, I don't see it, but I pray for it.
All right. We always appreciate your time on the program. Thank you so much, Michelle Agatishe, Senior Associate, leading law firm, Africa, Fellow Program for African Leadership, joining us on the program. Well, let's go over to South Africa, where its President Cyril Ramaphosa says the war in Ukraine has exposed the inability of the United Nations Security Council to fulfill its mandate of international peace and security. The president was speaking to the South African heads of mission from all over the world, where he touched on a number of current global happenings, and South Africa's stand on issues. He says South Africa is deeply concerned about the broader implications of the conflict in Ukraine for global economic recovery, to stress that his country will continue to defend its non-aligned position.
For the third time, South Africa has abstained from the more popular stand during the United Nations votes on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. President Cyril Ramaphosa, who spoke to his country's diplomats, says South Africa remains non-aligned.
We will defend our non-aligned position and maintain an independent foreign policy as well. We will pursue our national interest as we pursue the common interests of our global humanity.
The Minister for International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandor, who engaged with the media on the sidelines of that Heads of Mission conference in Pretoria, said being non-aligned does not mean the country is indifferent to the heartbreaking situation in Ukraine.
We have resisted in our responses, becoming embroiled in the politics of confrontation and aggression that have been advocated by the powerful countries. Before each vote, every foreign minister throughout the world is called by the various, for want of a better expression, protagonists. And we are asked to vote one way or the other. And we have been clear that we adopt an independent view as to how we vote. We cannot be directed by anyone. We have said we believe the aggressive discourse, the name-calling, and the use of the General Assembly for passing resolutions that add further criticism doesn't add to the resolution of the problem.
South Africa has called for urgent opening of more humanitarian corridors and disapproves of aggression of country against country in all forms and in any region, and accuses the United Nations of being selective in its reactions to similar situations.
This is something that concerns us, and we hope that we will see the United Nations acting with as great vigor by the powerful member states on Israel, on Morocco, and others who infringe the sovereignty of nations.
The ANC-led government insists that conflict can only end when dialogue begins, and a sustainable solution to conflict cannot be found if one party in that conflict is isolated. But not quite everyone in the country agrees with this stance, as the opposition Democratic Alliance has spoken out and has also begun a petition for the country to hold Russia to account for the invasion of Ukraine. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
Still ahead on the program, Slovakia donates its S-300 air defense system to Ukraine a day after the United States said it and 30 other countries were stepping up military aid to Kyiv. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Slovakia has donated its S-300 air defense system to Ukraine. Prime Minister Eduard Heger said this today after the U.S. said it and 30 other countries were stepping up military aid to Kyiv. Heger confirmed the delivery had been made in a video filmed on a train carrying him and European President as they visited Ukraine. The Slovak Defense Ministry released footage which they said showed the system being prepared to be sent to Ukraine. They declined to say when and where the footage was shot. The Slovak donation is the first known case of a country sending an air defense system to Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion in February 24. He also said Slovakia would receive additional equipment from NATO allies to make up for the donation. Defense Minister Jaroslav Nad subsequently announced that Slovakia would receive the fourth Patriot system from the United States next week. And the Senate and House cleared bills on Thursday, talking about the U.S. now, to revoke normal trade relations with Russia and ban oil imports from the country. A 1-2 punch that caps 3 weeks of negotiations over legislation to further isolate Moscow. It's the first time since Russia's February 24 invasion of Ukraine that Congress has sent sanctions and measures to President Joe Biden's desk. Lawmakers have mostly deferred to the White House to implement sanctions and other punitive measures against Russia. Many of them have been done in coordination with NATO countries and other allies. Well, our Washington, D.C. correspondent Maria Burr joins us now for more, and she is covering a press briefing at the White House. Hi, Maria. Thanks for joining us. Maria, let's begin. Very little appears to be known about President Putin's daughters and the sanctions. How would they impact them and in such a way that it also sends a message to their father, Putin?
You're exactly correct. You're just hearing, in recent conversations surrounding the fact that his daughters are now essentially going to feel some of the sanctions, and really it's financial. It's believed that some of the financial gains of President Putin of Russia are being, stored and being within the bank accounts of the daughters, which some of those are in the U.S. And so the question now is really about how the U.S. is going to be able to potentially freeze some accounts, potentially block some financial transactions for those daughters. And it's the thought is that through that impact potentially that will definitely impact the president of Russia.
And Ukraine has asked for more weapons to fight the war, while the U.S. has promised more military aid. What is the status of the promises and pledges?
Yes, the status at this time is that the military aid is definitely coming. We know that the U.S. has committed to that. We know that NATO has committed to that. And we know that that is what Ukraine has asked for. And so we're expecting that another round of military defense weaponry will be sent over to Ukraine, and that the U.S. will continue to support in that measure as long as it's required for Ukraine.
And Maria, countries voted just yesterday to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. It will be the second suspension in the history of the body. But how does that measure up against other countries' violations, especially the 5 members of the UN Security Council, seeing China on one hand, the US regarding Iraq, and then the Uyghur community?
You're exactly head on to what I think many Americans have asked that question, especially as it relates to China. But we all know that the U.S. and the Security Council have definitely brought forth allegations against other countries in the past. And I think right now the concern is what's happening in Ukraine, the invasion by Russia, and really looking at this as a war crime and looking at the way in which President Putin has gone in and invaded people and killed innocent people. And I think that in recent times, we have not seen this type of war that has been at the same scale. And so I think that's really what is pushing this forward. And this is why Russia is being kind of ousted and ostracized in this way.
Maria, just a little outside the situation in Ukraine, the U.S. Senate just voted, yesterday to admit Ketanji Brown Jackson as a Supreme Court Justice, and we know that's the reason why you are at the White House at the moment. The first African-American female to hold the position. How is she being regarded by colleagues and peers in the community with this win?
I think this is a moment of amazement, I think, for many Americans, especially those women of color, I think. And that's one of, I think, the triumphant moments for American history. And so as I stand, I hear cheering in the background for just such a momentous occasion as we look to see the first African-American. How will that end up changing the balance within the courts? How will that end up changing some of what we've seen in recent years as it relates to how cases are tried, especially those in the Supreme Court?
And certainly shows how diverse the Biden administration is, some would say. But how is her presence in the Supreme Court expected to improve the American justice system?
Her presence is going to greatly impact. We know that justice reform, we know that reform as it relates to many of the, whether or not it's drug reform issues, whether or not it's sentencing, mandatory sentencing guidelines, all of those are going to definitely be under review. So the real question is going to be, how much is she going to be able to push the needle to not only try cases and come up with actual results that end in what many might believe is a change in the tide, but also being able to adequately have an impact on some of the core laws that exist in America and some of the statutory guidelines.
Before we let you go, Republicans gave her a hard time during the screening. Do you think they will give her their support now?
The Republicans definitely did. You are going to always have a group that will definitely be on the outliers and will not have support. But I think that for the most part, you will see great support around her. You will see that both Democrats and Republicans are hoping that this is showing a new day in American history and that this is turning the page, especially as it relates to those justices in the Supreme Court.
Maria Bird, Washington, D.C. correspondent at the White House. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
And Ukrainian forces have successfully managed to counter Russia's attempt to take Kiev, but a significant battle is still ahead in the southeast of the country. This according to top U.S. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He told lawmakers during a hearing, he says, "I think it is an open question right now how this ends." He also said Ukraine is effectively using landmines in the conflict with Russia, forcing Russian armored vehicles into engagement areas where they are vulnerable to U.S.-supplied anti-tank weaponry. He says that's one of the reasons you see column after column of Russian vehicles that are destroyed. So anti-tank or anti-personnel mines are very effective.
And as for your question about whether they can win or whether we've given up on them winning, or does this mean that they can't win because we think it's going to go for a long time, the answer is absolutely not. Of course they can win this. And if you look at what they've been able to do just thus far, Mr. Putin has achieved exactly zero of his strategic objectives inside Ukraine. He didn't take Kyiv. He didn't topple the government. He didn't remove Ukraine as a nation state. And he's really only taking control of a small number of population centers, and even they weren't the ones that he was really going after. He's moved his forces out of Kyiv. He's moved his forces out of Chernihiv. They haven't taken Kharkiv. They haven't taken Mykolaiv in the south. So I think the proof is literally in the outcomes that you're seeing every day. The Ukrainians are bravely fighting for their country, and they have denied Mr. Putin so many of his strategic objectives. So absolutely they can win. And Phil, I don't think anybody knows for certain if the war isn't brought to an end through diplomacy, how long it could last. It's impossible to know that. I would tell you that it could end today. It could end today if Mr. Putin did the right thing, sat down in good faith with the Ukrainians, withdrew all his troops, sent them home, and respected Ukrainian sovereignty. He obviously is choosing a different path.
Well, the potential of African nations when it comes to possessing human and natural resources is undeniable. But the continental land of extraordinary opportunities has for centuries been beset by some rather serious threats, foreign and domestic. Well, at a special session of the U.S. Department of State's Africa Regional Media Hub on security and stability in Africa, the commander, Rear Admiral Jamie Sands, gave answers to questions from media participants from across the continent. Now, I earlier sent a question on Russia's influence on the continent with contractors such as the Wagner Group and how it affects Africa's security flowing from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This was his response.
I think Wagner is of particular concern on the African continent. If you look specifically at Mali, what we are seeing is we have a high level of confidence that we're seeing an increase or high level of confidence in the correlation between Wagner's arrival in Mali and the increase in reported atrocities in Mali. I would offer that Wagner leaves countries less secure, less safe, and poorer, just every time. With regard to your question about how, how the war in Ukraine is affecting Wagner on the continent, we really don't have any direct intelligence on that. I think that I've heard reports that I can't really confirm with any intelligence that I have that there has been a movement of Wagner from the African continent into the Ukraine, but I just don't have intelligence that would either confirm or deny that.
And that's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Stay safe.